Do you see what I see? Or maybe do we see what we see? Or heck, do I see what I saw? And what are we looking at anyway? For John, it's the heart of the divine. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. I want to begin this episode with a quick recap of the headlines, as it were, of the podcast so far. Episode 1, Beginnings, the beginnings of sacred texts as my focus, and so the beginning of the Gospel of John, and thus the focus on verses 1 through 18. And then Episode 2, the nature of the divine life, the first episode of the John episodes, which explore John's vision of the divine nature as towards and into, embracing, open, and then later also humble. Episode 3 I called The Lord of the Rings, the poetic soul of John and the structure of chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Sometimes I think poetry is truer than philosophy and logic. Art can be as much a carrier of spiritual reality as what we call religion. Episode 4, the availability of the divine life in the world, universally, everywhere, for all people, at all times, every place, and also then, according to John, particularly in a specific person and time and place. Which brought me to episode 5, the witness of John the Baptist to the divine life and light, a particular person here as a witness to that universal light, one who sees and then tries to show others something, in this case, the light that is already available to all of us anyway. A witness can help us see and believe what's always been there, but for which we've not taken time to look. And then episode 6, the revelation, the revealing of this life and the response to that. And that was part 1, because this will be part 2. The life and light available everywhere for everyone in the very world that came to be through it. The it now being revealed as a person, or as personal, or I prefer to say suprapersonal. And yet the response to that revealing, that self-offering, is tepid. Humanity in general doesn't know or recognize or receive the light and the life offered by that divine source as that source comes to us, towards us, into us, offering embrace, opening its very being to us. And now we come to part 2 of that ring D, verse 14 of John 1, which provides another example of John's way of showing us that the universal becomes extremely small and particular. In this case, the life and light which has been in the cosmos since the very beginning also took up residence in one particular human being within that cosmos, in a particular point of history. There are things in this single verse that we're going to be unpacking that resulted in centuries of debate among those who became known as Christians, things which form some of the central points of difference between Christianity and other ways of seeing the world. And we'll look at those eventually in another episode. But here in this second half of Ring D, chapter 1, verse 14, John has a lot to say about the relationship of the ontological reality of the divine being and the existential reality of a particular human being who lived and died in the first century of the Common Era. In other words, about the relationship of the divine being and the human being, Jesus. Keeping in mind that what John says about the divine being and the human being, Jesus, needs to be received within the framework of all 18 verses and the rest of the entire gospel. This episode is going to explore this single verse in detail. And as we proceed, we're going to see that John is not just presenting theoretical concepts, but is actually inviting a response, not just from his original readers, as if we could hold them at a distance, but inviting a response from you and I as well. In Ring D, Part 1, verses 9 to 11, John provided us with more insight into the nature of the divine being. That's been happening as we proceed through the rings. And what he talked about there is that the light, which we hear about in those verses, is another way of speaking of the divine. And so what we find out is that God is the Word towards God. God is the light that is in the world and through which the world came to be. So John introduced also some things about two respondents to that divine light, the world and his own, which, as it turns out, are really two ways of referring to the same responder. The world, which is God's very own. And we got glimpses of what those responses were to the divine light, which is God, which is the Word that is towards God. And the response is that the world, which is God's own, did not know or perceive and did not receive. And I referred to that as a sort of heartbreaking love story. And so here in verse 14, there's going to also be more insight from John about the character and nature of the divine, and then the topic of response is also going to resurface. In this case, we will be subtly invited. We will be subtly invited to become responders ourselves, invited to make all of this a first-person experience and to see for ourselves, as it were. So, verse 14, the Word became flesh and lived among us. We saw his glory, the glory of one who is unique, one of a kind from the Father, whose nature was full of grace, fully worthy of trust. Now, clause by clause, let's unpack that. The Word became flesh and lived among us. This takes us back actually to the very first mention of the Word, back in verses 1 and 2, where we saw that God is the Word that was always towards God. Verse 14 is actually the final direct mention of that word in John's Gospel, the logos in Greek. This time, the mention is in relationship to the world, which verses 3 to 5 told us came to be through God who is the Word. In other words, John first introduces this term Word in relationship to the divine being, and the divine being is that Word. And here he's introducing that Word, which is God, who is the Word towards God, in relationship with the world that came to be through God, who is the Word towards God. And that relationship of world and world is that the Word that was towards God, who is the Word towards God, became flesh. Now, some translations try to aim us towards certain possible interpretations of that word flesh, rather than just leaving it there, literally. And they do that by rendering this clause as either the Word became human, as in the New Living Translation, or the Word became a human being, the Good News Translation, or even the Word became a man, the easy-to-read version. But what does John actually want us to understand? What did the Word, or rather, what did God, who is the Word, become in this verse? John is once again, I think, selective in his word choice. Had he wished to make a clear statement about the Word becoming human or a human being specifically and narrowly, he had options for that. He could have used the word ἀνθρώπος. That can mean a person, or it can be gender specific, a man, or it can be used as a singular to refer to persons or humanity, as in humankind. We know that John's familiar with the ways that he could use that term, because we've already seen him use it to refer to humanity and human beings when he wrote, in an earlier ring that we looked at, the light was the light of humankind, and the light that enlightens every human being. Both examples use that word ἀνθρώπος. And John also had another expression available to him, an idiom, using the phrase born of women. People are born of women, so that's a way to refer idiomatically to human beings. So had John intended for us to understand that now the word became human or even a human, he clearly could have made that clear. Instead, he says, this word became flesh. This word that is God, who is the Word, became flesh. The Greek word used here is sarx, which has a range of meanings in the New Testament. First, there's a set of meanings in which it's used to refer to humans. For example, the totality of human existence, including but not only our physical nature, flesh as our humanness, our human condition, you might say, which again is not just flesh, but and bone and body and muscle and blood, but all the dimensions of what it means to be human, to have human existence. So flesh can be used in that way. It can also be used to refer to the weak, transitory, impermanent nature of our existence, but of all existence. Human existence in particular, but of everything. Secondly, a more inclusive usage, humans, but also much wider, there is a use of this term for the literal biological flesh of something, including our muscles and bones, but also, for example, the pulp or flesh of a piece of fruit is referred to as sarx. And also it's used to refer to any living creature. For example, back in Genesis, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures in Genesis refers to anything that has the breath of life, quote unquote, inclusive of animals and birds in particular. And then in Genesis 7, we learn that the great flood destroyed all flesh, all sarx that moved on the earth during the flood, both humans and also every type of animal. And that would have included, at that point, reptiles and all sorts of things. Given this broader range of implications of this term, including its usage beyond just a reference to human beings, and given that had John wanted us to think only in terms of the word becoming human, he had other options, I think we need to assume John has the broader, more inclusive understanding of what the word sarx, or flesh, implies when he selects that word to describe what it was that God, who is the Word towards God, became. Namely, that the Word, capital W there in my head, in some mysterious way that John does not explain, became not simply human or ahuman, but part of the physical cosmos, the natural world that had also come into being through the Word, which is, again, God, remember, which is now becoming part of it. At the same time, this is not some sort of vague, generalized wearing of creation, like putting on clothes, but rather the word became connected with the cosmos itself through becoming human, and became human by becoming a human. This is yet another instance of John's paradoxical vision of general and specific that we've noted a number of times, universal in particular. The light enlightens everyone, but also each one, for example. And now this seems to be another instance. It seems clear to me that John wants us to include the bigger cosmic implications of this, and hence chooses to use the less specific term flesh, not man. Yet at the same time, John wants us to see the uniqueness of this in humanity, and then even more specifically in one particular person whose identity has been barely introduced so far in these 18 verses. The remainder of John's writing will be devoted to revealing more about that person, and by doing so, and this is really, really important, I think, he reveals more about the divine being as well. This particular person is the one in whom the God that is the Word, that is the light, became flesh as human, and in the universal cosmic sense as well. The particular reveals the universal, and we can't forget that. The whole point of what we see in this human being, Jesus, that lived in a certain point of time for John, is that we see something vaster. We see what was already present as the light that enlightens everyone and was present in the world. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, this verse has given rise in the Christian world to centuries of reflection, theological statements, creedal formulae, to try to articulate what Christians call the incarnation, the enfleshment of the divine word. And I plan to say more about the implications of John 1 for really a number of topics, including the implications of this section of the gospel for some of the themes in the Christian creeds, and I'll do that in a whole separate episode. For now, I want to move on to the next portion of this clause. Having become flesh, we're told, that word lived among us, or in Greek, ἐσκενόσεν, ήμεῖν. Literally, he tented in us. The Word that is God, and through whom everything came into being, took up residence here, lived among us, actually literally lived in us. The reference to tenting is an allusion to the sacred tent that Moses had set up in the wilderness, in which God's presence was understood to dwell. Although, and I think this is really crucial, and I think John assumes that his Hebrew readers, his Jewish readers, would understand this, that divine presence dwelling in that tent among the people was only seen by Moses, whereas John now says, we saw. Verse 14 again, the Word became flesh and lived among us, or in us, and we saw. This theme of sight and of seeing is a big one in John. There are people who see but do not believe, for example, in the story he's going to tell. There are people who see but don't see, paradoxically, because they don't recognize what they're seeing. There's a crucial turning point in the narrative in chapter 12 when some non-Hebrews come and say, we want to see Jesus. We want to see. Closer to our context, in the section following these verses, verses 1 to 18, which have been my focus, there are several mentions of seeing in the story, in encounters between John the Baptist and his followers and people who might become the earliest followers of Jesus. I'm not going to rehearse them all here. I just want to point to one specific example because I think it relates well, it doesn't just relate well, it actually reveals to us something really important about the very first words of Jesus as those are recorded by John. John the Baptizer, at one point, having seen Jesus, there's that word, points him out to some of his own followers who leave to begin to follow after Jesus. Likely at this stage, not following in the sense of becoming disciples or following him like a guru, but likely just to pay a visit and introduce themselves at this stage, get to know this person that John has pointed to. At one point, as they're following behind him, Jesus turns around and speaks the first words that John records on his lips. What do you seek? They responded, where do you stay? To which Jesus responded, come and see. Now, there's a lot more to that brief exchange than may meet the eye. And I think John has packed a lot into it. He's really good at that. For example, the fact that Jesus' first words in the Gospel of John are, what do you seek? Is a very subtle way, I think, of the author looking at you and I, the audience, and asking us that question. After all, we're, in our imaginations, following along with those two that took off after Jesus after John pointed to them. So when he turns around and says, what do you seek? He's asking us just as much as them. And so, that makes me want to pause and ask myself and you, well, what are you seeking as you explore the Gospel of John? You've been listening to this episode and maybe to others for a reason. And what am I seeking as I'm recording them? Might be worth a pause at this point to answer that for ourselves. Well, whether you hit the pause button or not, here's what comes next. It it's a very natural question, or a very natural response to his question, and their response comes in the form of a natural question, which is, where are you staying? However, when that question is set within the whole Gospel of John, the theme of dwelling and staying and remaining becomes actually a much bigger thing, and John is pinging on that before we know it. He's already setting the stage. In chapters 14 through 17, for example, it's very clear that where Jesus actually lives is in God, and where God lives is in him, a mutual indwelling, which Jesus says his followers can share. He says things when he's praying like, they in us and we in them. Then, too, dwelling is also hinted at elsewhere in verses 1 to 18. Remember, the light was in the world. That's where it lived. And the light is the God who is the Word towards God, which is who became flesh in that world and dwelt there, in this person. Ultimately, then, the dwelling of God is in the cosmos, and it's in the sarx, it's in the flesh, it's in Jesus, and the dwelling of the world is in God. All the universal and the particulars are all wound up together in those statements. It's all in each other. That's where dwelling happens. So the simple question, where do you stay, has an ultimate answer that's much more mysterious than meets the eye. And since that longer answer is so vast and mysterious, Jesus' short answer to the question there on the spot is not to try to explain all that, but to simply say in response to the question, where do you stay? Come and see. Come and experience it for yourself, which I think is an invitation to you and I as well. Now, back to the flow of verse 14, which makes mention of who it is who's doing the seeing. The Word became flesh, lived among us, and we saw. Well, who's the we here? Some scholars suggest that John's introducing a hard and clear dividing line between a we that's on sort of this side, John's side, and an implied they on the other side, a line drawn in the sand between those who did not see and those who did see. However, John uses the word see in a much less decisive way, as we've noted before. I was tempted to say, as we've seen before. There are people who see but don't believe what they see. There's people who see but don't see. They don't perceive or recognize what they're seeing, but they do see. So that suggests to me that John might be saying we saw as in we all. The fact that the whole focus of John 1 so far has been the universal nature of things adds weight to this for me. True, John includes references to the particular, as we've seen, there's that word again, as well as the universal, but the force and the impact of the particular stem from being expressions of the universal and vice versa. The whole point is about the universal becoming particular and then showing us the universal. The fact that each thing comes to be through God adds force to the fact that everything comes to be through and in God. The fact that the light enlightens each person adds force to the fact that the light is the light of all humanity. And now, the Word became flesh in one particular person, but as a dimension of being present in the cosmos, and thus to be seen by all, even if not recognized or truly, actually seen. Which begins to raise one of John's implicit questions to the reader, to you and I. What do you seek, and what do you see? And do you see? So, who then is this we? Well, in a very real sense, we're we. I believe it is the author's way of subtly inviting us to be part of the we, and to see, to all his readers. The whole gospel is an invitation to see what John has seen. So he's saying, we saw, but implied in that is the question, yeah, but did you? Near the end of the book, John says he's bearing witness, which is basically a way of asking others to see. That witnesses say, this is what I saw, and I want you to see it too. He's a witness to what he witnessed. It's another way of talking about what he saw, as I just said. The whole point of John's gospel is to show us something that we are now invited to see. Just like those early words of Jesus, come and see. John is saying that to us. I believe John, as a gifted artist and poet, is drawing us into the first person plural here, inviting us to stand inside the story and to see. Now, this does raise a question. Given that the Word became flesh at a point in time and in a specific person, as well as in a more cosmic sense, becoming flesh, how can we say that we saw it? I mean, what about the we of humanity prior to that person, or distant in time or space? Even if they were contemporaries in human history, what if they never had a chance to actually see? What about people who've never heard about all this to begin with? Can we say that we see includes them? The answer to that lies, I think, in John's understanding of the reality of who this Word is that became flesh in that human being. At the risk of being overly repetitious, it's the Word that is the light of all. It's the light that shines everywhere for everybody. So all have seen, or at least they've all had the chance to see. And verse 14 is revealing a new dimension to an ancient ongoing reality, certainly, but it's not a new reality. This isn't a new being that is having a chance to be seen. It's nothing new except for the particularization of the universal presence of the divine light. But the particularization of it in a person at a point in time does not cause the universality of the light's visibility to cease. It is still there for all to see, as it always has been. And the light we see in that particular person is the same light that is available to be seen by all. So John can say, we saw. But what is there to be seen in this particular person? Verse 14 again. The Word became flesh, lived among us, and we saw what exactly? We saw his glory is the first thing. Glory is a word that refers to the light or radiance of something, which is, of course, in keeping with this theme of light that we've been tracing. John's still pinging in that sort of what's called semantic domain, light and radiance and all of that. Well, glory is in that domain. So in one sense, John is saying we saw the light, which is the light of humanity, the light shining in the darkness, the light that flows from the life which is in God, the light through which everything came to be, and is thus also the light that is the God, that is the Word, that is towards God. We saw that light, that glory of his, because the word glory, doxa, contains all of that I just said when we put it together. But John isn't done yet. The Word became flesh, lived among us, and we saw his glory. And it was like the glory of something or someone else. He's going to describe what that glory was like. And he says it's like the glory of someone who is a unique, one-of-a-kind from the Father. It is a glory that is full of grace, fully worthy of trust. Those are two different clauses, and he's packed a lot into those. So first, the first clause that I'll look at is the glory is like one who is a monogenes, a unique one-of-a-kind from a father. Now, I spent a lot of time in a prior episode detailing what that Greek word monogenes means, one and only, unique, one of a kind. Contrary to popular Christian understanding, when they read this passage, oftentimes, the word doesn't refer to begetting. This isn't about the begetting of the Word or of Jesus. Not even necessarily is it referring to sonship or daughtership specifically, in other words, childship. Although that idea is lurking, monogenes can be used to refer to a unique anything. I make this point by way of emphasis, because the next section of John, the portion I've called the pearl, the very center of the rings forming verses 1 to 18, does use the term begetting and child and children. And I don't want to dull the force of what John wants to say there. Or, maybe to put it a better way, I think John avoids using the term beget here so as not to dull the force of that pearl that is coming at the very center. However, neither do I want us to miss what John is in fact saying here. John wants to be clear. There is something one of a kind about the Word becoming flesh in this person. John says the Word became flesh, a word John uses, as we've seen, to indicate that the Word became more than human. It became not just infleshed, but in cosmode, we could say. At the same time, this happened in real time, and in a particular time, and thus in real flesh and blood, and thus in a person's flesh and blood. To be universal, this had to happen in particular. To be real, it had to happen in particular. But it was also universal nonetheless, and has implications for us, as we will see in the next episode. Now, to the second clause, full of grace and truth is how it's often rendered in other translations. John likely has in mind here two divine qualities that are often paired in the Hebrew sacred texts, chesed and emet. Chesed's meaning includes mercy, kindness, goodness, and emet is a term usually translated as truth, but which is quite different than just rational truth. It connotes something enduring, reliable, faithful, loyal, trustworthy. It's essentially a relational term. Hence my translation, full of grace, fully worthy of trust. Now, I want to begin to summarize things and set things up for the next episode. It's difficult to pull all the threads together because so much is contained in this ring, just this ring, verses 9 to 11 and verse 14. But here's my attempt to recap everything so far, verses 1 to 11 and 14 to 18, setting aside 12 and 13 for now because those are the pearl at the center that we're turning to next. So here's my summary of it all. The God who is the Word towards God, the God who is leaning into God's own self, whose very nature is embrace, who brings God out into the open to be seen, the God who's humble, the God in and through whom all came to be, in whom is life itself, the God whose light shines always for all people everywhere, the God who is that light, the God who is in the world which came to be through God, that God became part of the world, indwelt and inhabited the world that came to be through him, and as such can be seen, known, experienced. The glory or nature of that God is grace and mercy and love, a love that is enduring and reliable, a love that can be counted upon to last. That is the one-of-a-kind, unique character of the divine heart. That's the heart of the divine for John, and that's the heart he wants us to see and experience and know and receive. Now, finally, as I begin to wrap this up, I want to make two last points about the importance of John's statement that the Word became flesh, sarx. And the first is the Word, logos, remember, God who is the Word that is towards God, is actually revealed in sarx, in flesh. It's in, actually, the weakness and temporary nature of flesh, the weakness and temporary nature of existence itself, that we can see the fullness of the divine nature, the glory of the divine being, according to John. And second, that Word is revealed in sarx, in and not through the sarx. There are ways of understanding the relationship between the divine and the world as one that is absolutely separate and distinct, the existence of the divine being entirely separate from that of the world and nature. And there's ways of understanding that relationship that emphasizes the absolutely indistinguishable oneness and unity of the divine with everything, and vice versa. But John is presenting us with a both and, not an either or. For John the Creator, as he uses this term of becoming flesh, sarx, is inextricably bound up with the creation, in it, connected with it, tied to it. The sarx of the natural world is not just a means or a channel or an instrument, not just clothes that God wears or a tool that God uses. It is part of the revelation event itself, inextricably woven with the Creator in it and it in the Creator. And according to John, this happened in such a way that the divine dwelt among us and we saw. And thus John writes in part, again, as an invitation to his readers, to us, to see and share his vision of reality. But first, let's be sure we get everything into the frame so that we can look at the fullness of what John is presenting for us to see. We've seen a lot already, but his picture is not just for us. His message is not just to us. John has something to say directly about us. The rings have been pulling us stage by stage to that something and to the pearl at the center, which is where I will go next time.